one told me about him, how people cry. Well, it's too late to say you're sorry. How would I know? Why should I care? There's no bother trying to find him. He's not there. Well, let me tell you about the way he looks, the way he acts, and the color of his hair. His voice is soft and good, his eyes are clear and bright, but he's not there.
So anyway, Hoffa was known for promptness. If you were late, he got mad. That was the one requirement that he made of people that he did business with and had meetings with. So although he showed up promptly before the 2 o'clock meeting, by 10 after he was starting to get irate. And the evidence they have from the Michigan Bell telephone log was that at 2:15 he called his wife Josephine. He had gone in briefly to the Red Fox and was seen by the waitress and the hostess. Although the manager of the Red Fox says he didn't come in, two people claimed, yeah, he came in and spoke with them briefly. So that's documented in the Hoffax files. Then he was seen talking on the phone over by Demon Hardware, and that's where the phone log was obtained by the FBI. So he called and he was cussing at his no-shows. Tony Giacalone and Provenzano didn't show up, so he told Josephine, I'm heading home. I'll be there to cook the steaks by 4 o'clock. After he hung up with her, then he called Louis Linto at the airport service limousine, who answered. And then phone records show that call came in at 2:35. Before this, I believe, is even before Hoffa was spotted. One witness was parked, and a man came out and confronted him and said, "What are you doing? What do you want?" And he identified from pictures that was Salvador Bergoglio, Sally Bugs Bergoglio. So they have in their files at FBI that Bergoglio was spotted at the Red Fox that afternoon. So after the phone call to Louis Linto, two men, I believe they were realtors, real estate agents, introduced himself to Hoffa and talked to him briefly. They told the FBI the subject matter of the conversation was casual, shook hands, and he was friendly. And he mentioned his wife, Josephine, was going to have cataract surgery, which was not common knowledge. Nobody would know that unless Hoffa told them themselves. So those witnesses were validified by the subject matter of the conversation they had. The next witness saw him getting into the Mercury Marquis with three other men. And then the last witness to see him in the car, which was behind the driver, was a delivery truck driver. And he was entering the same driveway they were leaving, which was the southernmost east driveway of the Red Fox. He said he had to slam on his brakes of his delivery truck. He was making delivery to the center, and in order to keep from being hit by the car that swerved towards him. So he had to come to a quick stop. He noticed Hoffa in the backseat. He recognized Jimmy Hoffa, and he was kind of leaning forward, gestures, and he said he had the feeling he was having words with the driver. He said there were two men in the front seat and another man with Hoffa on the opposite side of the car in the back seat. He also noticed that there was the muzzle of a shotgun sticking out between the two men in the back underneath a gray blanket. And when they did impound the car on August 9th, there was a shotgun in the trunk. So that truck driver is the last witness on record that said then the car continued and made a right-hand turn and swerved as it left, heading southbound on Telegraph Road. That's it. Or what if I could convince you that there is more to the story? That isn't all there is. So Telegraph Road was a pretty busy main artery to the, let's see, it would be the northwest suburbs of Bloomfield and the lakes and things like that. And as I said, it was pretty well traveled. Whereas Woodward Ave, and that took you more to Pontiac, the next large city from Detroit, where they eventually moved the Tiger Stadium and Lions and Tigers played, Silverdome. So Woodward was not the best route of travel. Telegraph actually was closer to my sister Helen's house. Now along Telegraph Road there were also entrances and exits to a few freeways that also was the fastest way into downtown Detroit. Didn't have any lights and things that you would have gotten if you'd stayed on Telegraph. Had 4 lanes in each direction with a median landscape, not very wide, but a landscape median that went up in the middle with some turnarounds randomly placed. When you exited that driveway, though, at the Red Fox, you had no choice but to turn right or go south. If you wanted to go north, you would have gone outside the northern exit from the shopping center and then gone on to Maple Road and made your turn and ended up going north on Telegraph. So the rumors saying that Hoffa was taken elsewhere, northern locations or other directions, don't fit the evidence. Okay, that's my customary sip of coffee before I start. So this is still a prologue, but it's part 2, and I'll try and wrap it up pretty quick. I just give you a recap from part 1. There's some overlap there, but I want to make sure that there's some continuity when I get into the rest of this chapter and into chapter 2. So chapter 1 is the prologue again. It does tell the story basically of what my parents saw that afternoon. It was a Wednesday, 91 degrees in Detroit, July 30th, 1975, and they had planned a 2-night outing with my sister to go to Lake Pinckney. My sister was Helen Kirsten, her and her husband John, and they had an 18-month-old daughter, Dawn. So I wasn't going on the trip. I was married that January of 1975, and we were living with my parents in their townhome, which was at Bloomfield Terrace. It's called Colonial Court Terraces now. It's on about 15.5 mile of Woodward in Bloomfield Township, same town as Amaka's Red Fox. So that afternoon they had been packing all morning. They knew they had to be at my sister's by 4, and it was about an hour and 30-minute drive. So they left a little past 2 o'clock, but 2:15 approximately. They weren't clock watchers, but they were paying attention that they had to be in Westland by 4. And then John was going to come home, Helen's husband, and they were going to leave right away to go to Lake Pinckney for 2 nights camping. They had a camper, pop-up camper they were going to bring. So that sounded good, and I just didn't want to go. So I stayed home, but next I heard from them was the story about what they saw on the way. So the normal route of travel, I've been giving you maps and everything, but it was about a half a mile south on Woodward, and then turning west on Maple and heading over to Telegraph. Then they would head south on Telegraph, and right at that intersection of Maple and Telegraph is the Amaka's Red Fox. Just as they're passing, this is where the family secret starts and other witnesses left off. As I mentioned, the truck driver is the last recorded witness to see the Mercury leaving, said it swerved and headed south. My dad liked to drive in the fast lane, the number 4 lane closest to the median. So he was trekking along in that lane. My mom was a passenger, and she noticed out of the corner of her eye this big maroon colored, she didn't know what kind of car. I think she called it a Continental, but again, I told you Mercury and Continental looked the same that year. And because it was swerving, it caught her eye. She turned to the right and saw it, and it pulled right up behind the bumper of my parents' car. And so then, just moments later, it pulls up alongside my mother's side of the car, within a couple of feet. My mom looks over and she sees the driver staring at her, and my dad says, "Francis, quit looking," and right away he recognizes the driver. He says, "That's the mafia." He says, "Quit looking." So she made her look even more. The Godfather had come out a few years before that, and when you grew up in Detroit, you were well aware of the mafia, and the Godfather kind of told that type of story, even though it wasn't about Detroit. It was about a fictitious family in New York, an Italian-American Sicilian family. So, but it applied to a lot of the different families all over the country. So Detroit was no different. I had worked a couple of union jobs. My dad was always fighting the union. His employees were waiters and waitresses, so they were picketing at times, and he was successful in warding off the union from signing up his staff. Darby's had about 450 employees, so that was quite a haul for the union if they signed him up. So anyway, so they go from Bloomfield Terrace. Just as they're passing the Red Fox, this car pulls out, and right up next to their bumper pulls up next to my mother. They're looking back and forth, and my mom and the driver is having a staring contest, glaring at my mom and dad's car. And I don't know if he recognized my dad or not, but my mom then kind of cast towards the back of the Mercury, and she says, "There's something going on in the back seat, Ken." She says, like they're holding down a big dog or something. And what she was looking at was two big men with their knees and legs jammed right up into their chin and their chest. And one guy was holding a leash or a rope that was closest to her. And so that she said, "They're holding a big dog down or something." She said, "I don't know what's going on." But he said, "Well, quit looking." So this goes on for moments. They're driving for a bit. Then the Mercury kind of trails back a little bit and pulls right back up right beside him again. And again, the driver's staring at my mom and dad, and these two men are still fussing with something in the back seat. I mean, really fighting with something to keep it down. Again, their knees are up to their chin, and this rope is still being flailed around or strapped. So my mom says again, they're trying to keep a big dog down. My dad says, "Quit looking, that's Chucky O'Brien, it's the mafia. You want to end up in the Detroit River?" That was where we figured most of the bodies went. So anyway, this went on for several miles, and then finally my dad started to get nervous. Why would Chucky O'Brien be staring at them? They didn't feel threatened. They didn't know what was going on. They did not see Hoffa, as I said before. They did not witness Hoffa in the car, but they witnessed activities that were corroborated with the last known witness to see the car leave. So for about 5 miles, then my dad slows his car down. He wants to create some distance between them and this car that he knows is the mafia. That car pulls up ahead of them, speeds up even, and pulls ahead of them a little bit. And my dad is slowed down, give some distance between them. He's a little nervous now, and they're both kind of wondering why, but don't have the answers. And then they get close to 10 Mile, and at that intersection there's a restaurant, banquet hall. It has 3 restaurants. It's called the Raleigh House, and it catered to a lot of Jewish clientele in the Southfield, Oak Park, that part of suburban Detroit. And my dad knew it well, because he was actually hired to manage the place just the year before, almost exactly a year before, June of 1975. So in 1974, Sammy Lieberman is the owner, or was an owner, and he hired my dad on the spot because they were looking for somebody that was really good at preparing kosher food and knew how to prepare the meat and all. And my dad was the manager of Darby's restaurant at 7 Mile in Wyoming in Detroit, which was, I didn't know it at the time. I don't think I was even in there past the front door when I was in high school, junior high. And actually, he started there in 1960 and worked till about June or July of 1968. So he was known for that because Darby's was really they also had, if you didn't have a coat and tie, you had to sit in the coffee shop. And they had a coffee shop. They had a live music piano lounge called the Skylight Room, and the mafia hung out there. And of course, my dad knew that because he seated everybody that walked in the door. And if someone had special orders, he would go back and let the chef know this so and so is here. He had known by name. He also caught on soon after he started that at Darby's that he was working in a place where the owner was known to have been associated with the Purple Gang back in the day, which they eventually just became the Jewish Mafia. They worked closely with the Italian Mafia. So he knew about that. But getting back to the Raleigh house, again, that's why he was hired. Once Sammy found out that he was the manager of Darby's, he hired him on the spot. And they had just tripled the size of the restaurant. I mean, the kitchen. So they car turns left, goes across Telegraph Road, pulls behind the Raleigh house as my mom and dad are approaching. Then slowly, they're both looking over, and they see the car pull beyond the Raleigh house at the southeast or back corner of the building, which happens to be where the kitchen door would have been located. And then it comes to a stop, sticking out about 2/3 of the car length. And my mom and dad now are just about even with that end of the building, the south end of the building, and they can see that the car had stopped. And just off to the right, within feet, is Detroit. My dad said Detroit garbage truck. And he didn't say it was the type of truck that would have taken the bin. They had an 8-foot by 8-foot by 20-foot bin at the other end of the building, the north end, enclosed. You had to access it from inside the building, but that was at the other end of the building. This garbage truck was parked like it was waiting for this car, and it was facing the street. The distance is about 150 feet from the number 4 lane to the back corner of that building. So it was well within visibility of my parents as they now are kind of slowly passing by wondering what was going on. They didn't have the answers, like I said. They continued to my sister's house and arrived. My sister said, I didn't talk to her for years about it. We didn't really discuss this. So they did show up. My sister ends up telling me before 4 o'clock, maybe even well before 4. So that matches the time frame of the hour to 20 hour and 30 minutes from our town home to her house in Westland off of Grandview. So I'll be sharing that story with you, but I'm not really going to give you her version of it, but there's a special treat for you here soon where I've actually got her on camera telling the story herself. But I fashioned the book and the story in the same time chronology as events happened. And of course, we heard the story, and I didn't think of recording her until decades later, 3 decades later. So that's why I'm not going to present that until the appropriate time frame when it occurred in the book. So, but before we get into the details, you need to know something about my parents. So by the time you do hear the story, it's believable. You know who they are. You know a little bit about the background. My dad's career in the restaurant business and why he would even know that this was Truckee O'Brien. This was not a rumor. It wasn't hearsay. When you finally hear it from my mom, you'll know that every word I told you it was from her. I didn't make up a part of it. So stay tuned for that. All in all, the unfortunate part of this is because of events earlier in my dad's career at Darby's, they didn't go to the police, and it was fear. But knowing my dad, it wasn't fear of him being harmed. It was fear of harm to his family. My mom, and we had 3 kids, us kids, and he was the same age as Hoffa, 62. He was born in 1912, June, and Hoffa was born in February of 1913. So my dad was about 8 months older than Jimmy Hoffa, and they came from the same cloth as far as the things that they experienced in life, from all the way from the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. Then there was the Roaring Twenties, the Depression. I'm kind of skimming through this quickly because I do cover it later, but they were both the greatest generation. They had survival skills from the things that went on. It seems like every 10 years there was catastrophes around the world. After the Roaring Twenties and the Depression with World War II in the 40s, and then of course this Korean War in the 50s, but then civil rights in the mid-late 50s into the 60s movement. And it seems like they just had to learn how to weather things. It wasn't unheard of when men worked 2 jobs, even 3, to get by. Women were not working members of the family predominantly, unless they were single moms, of course. So just to kind of set a framework, if all these other rumors you have to kind of put aside, because I want you to see this as though it were July 30th, 1975. That means you haven't heard all the rumors yet. You haven't heard all the stories and theories or the evidence. So nobody knows about this until it breaks the headlines and the TV news until 2 days later on Friday, August 1st. And that's when my parents discovered what they really saw as well. So just kind of play the role of putting everything out of your mind that you've already learned or heard about. It's the only way that you'll be able to receive this information honestly. So I just encourage you to do that for yourself. And you can add it all back in after the book and all, after this story is presented to you, if you want to. If you have some, affection for it and you want to add it back in and just cancel this story out, by all means, you're welcome. So I'll introduce you to Kenneth and Frances Tubman, my parents. And Ken was from Boston. He was born in Boston. Never lost his Boston accent. My mom referred to him as a Yankee. She was from Roanoke, Virginia, south of the Mason-Dixon line. So I point out in the book that there's 3 times that my dad and Hoffa crossed paths, although they never met. Well, maybe they never met. I don't know that. But with my dad confronting the picketers and the union, he knew who Hoffa was and who Chucky O'Brien was and other members of the union. I mean, they would come to his place of business. He didn't own the business. He never owned a business, but he was manager for other people his entire life. So I guess New Englanders, but the Midwest and New Englanders had kind of the same work ethic. Same work ethic, meaning that they were hard workers, workaholics even, and although they had different paths, they did cross paths. The first time I would say was 1957. Now 1957, a quick rundown on my family, and I was born in 51 in Baltimore, Maryland, and at the time my dad managed the 2400, which was in Washington, D.C. And you might figure the 2400 was Pennsylvania Avenue up the street from the White House, which was 1600 Pennsylvania Ave, so it wasn't very far from the White House. The 2400 was a pretty high-end hotel, and we lived in the hotel, and I was born, and I had my brother and sister were all born before me. And so I don't remember much about that. I was obviously pretty young. But that was in the early to mid 50s. Then we moved to Boston. And Boston, we lived in 3 places in Massachusetts. One was a dairy farm. We lived in Boston City. I remember the subways, even as a little kid. We lived in Massachusetts till I was about 4 and a half, maybe even 5. Then we moved to Revere Beach on the coast. And I don't remember my dad's work. It wasn't the Washington any longer, obviously, but he was looking for a better job, and he heard of one in Miami Beach. So he came home one night and told us he's going to manage the Balmoral Hotel in Miami Beach, Florida. And we're moving to Florida. So us kids were all excited. I'm moving to Florida. Well, Balmoral was on Sunset Strip, North Miami, and we ended up moving into a house across the street, Collins Avenue, next to a big power plant. And so this location, the Balmoral, was owned by the same owners as the Kenilworth and the Fontainebleau. And a lot of people have heard of the Fontainebleau, but may have not been familiar with the Balmoral and the Kenilworth. So this is the first time Jimmy Hoffa was running for president. He kind of helped feed the feds some information about Dave Beck, I learned. And he became president from vice president, and Dave Beck became imprisoned. So he became president of Teamsters, and this convention was held in Miami when he was announcing and we're going to run campaigning, and that goes all up and down the Miami Sunset Strip. So my dad's hotel was involved in that as well. So he probably ran across at least the conventioners and was aware of the union and everything. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters and the other unions were all on the same convention. It also happens to be when Fidel Castro came into power, and Fidel Castro was far right extremist, socialist, and his intent to kick the mafia out of Havana, Cuba. They had set up the shop with gambling casinos and all that other stuff because they were really being pressured by the Kennedys, Robert Kennedy in particular, and the McClellan Commission, and forced to set up shop offshore 90 miles away on the island of Cuba. So they were making tens of millions of dollars a month, and Fidel Castro kicking them off, they wanted to do something about it. So our government also wanted to do something about Fidel Castro, and the head of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover. Now J. Edgar Hoover, it was known by some that he was into some perverse sexual activities, and the mafia knew that, and hearsay is that the reason why they had him over somewhat of a barrel is they knew about it, because they were all involved in the hotel industry, the mafia, and he was, I guess, being blackmailed about some activity in one of the hotels with a partner. So, but J. Edgar Hoover never referred to the mafia by that name, and intentionally, it's said, but he even said it didn't exist. Well, by the time Kennedy's got to the McClellan Commission, they called it La Cosa Nostra, LCN abbreviated, and that eventually evolved into the mafia. But La Cosa Nostra, based in Sicily originally, and then brought over to the United States with Italian descendants, still has strong ties to Italy and Sicily. So there was two sides of this story, and they both wanted to do away with Fidel Castro. So they were joining up, and two hitmen were picked by the mafia, and the feds helped subsidize and help plan and were complicit, I'll put it that way, with the assassination of Fidel Castro. But what I read was that these two hitmen chickened out, the mafia chickened out, because Fidel Castro caught on, and he was vicious. His undercover agents were, I guess, better than the FBI, and they knew what was going to happen. He knew what was going to happen, so he was well prepared. So they didn't. It was something that never happened. The McClellan Commission did put Beck in prison, but Hoffa was acquitted on similar charges. Had to do with pension funds. So Hoffa becomes president, goes back to Detroit, and we ended up leaving Miami about 1958, late 1958, maybe early 59. And my dad found another job because of all these people coming over to Cuba. They were affecting the pay rate and the job stability in Miami with the hospitality industry. So I don't understand all the particulars. I was only 6, 7, and 8 years old when we lived in Miami, Florida. So that perspective I wasn't aware of. So briefly, we moved to Savannah, Georgia. My dad found work in it was an up-and-coming area called Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. And they were going to build for the first nine-hole golf course. And the Hilton Head Inn, because my dad had experience in Miami Beach, were really interested in my dad helping to run it. The owners had visions of it becoming a resort as well at this time. And so this is 1959. And so we live right next to the Hilton Head Inn on the water in the upper flat of a two-story house. And it was fun. We would have oyster roasts on Friday. We'd watch movies, swim in the pool. My dad would make us sandwiches. He had a cook, and he always directed the chefs. He was very enthusiastic about helping chefs with recipes and food preparation. And this guy was more of a cook than a chef. But as it turned out, we didn't have a school on Hilton Head. We had to ride the school bus 25 miles over to Bluffton, South Carolina, which my sister Helen, my older brother Ken, and I did every day. And one day a week we didn't make it. The bus would break down. The driver was a senior from the high school, Bluffton High School. So that was our experience at Hilton Head. It ended. One day we were riding the bus to school, and we see our big green Buick fly past us, wondering where our dad was going. And we didn't know when we got home that night that the cook had broken into the Hilton Head safe, stolen the money, took my dad's car, and headed to the mainland off the island. And so they had some suspicion that my dad was in on this. Of course he wasn't. But it kind of started to spell the end because they were selling the hotel. This thing never got solved. They never caught the cook, and we never got the car back. We don't know what happened to it. And so things didn't look so rosy at Hilton Head anymore. So my dad thought my mother had a sister in Detroit, and they had been in Detroit before. My brother was actually born there during the war, 1944. So we had relatives in Detroit. We moved in with them in Detroit. Drove all the way from. We got a rental car. Drove from Hilton Head to Detroit. Took a couple of days, 3 days, and we show up and move in with my aunt and uncle and 2 cousins. And so off of Penrod in Detroit, Penrod, Michigan Ave. So I'll probably just flash a couple of pictures up here about the times that were going on back then for both Jimmy Hoffa and my dad in different worlds. And then I'll bring you up to speed in Chapter 2 with life in Detroit, Michigan, the mafia and the restaurant business. Thanks. God bless. Please like and share to as many people as you can this story. As of late, you've probably heard that they came up empty-handed in New Jersey, and I think this story might catch a little more traction now that that's kind of been eliminated as the main focus of the FBI. So I appreciate you sharing, liking, following. This is the only place you're going to hear this story, and I'll do my best to present it clearly. Thank you.
Well, no one told me about him, the way you lied. Well, no one told me about him, how people